In 1957, Ford built a factory supercharged V8 that made 300 horsepower, more than most muscle cars would produce a decade later. Yet by the time the GTO hit the streets in 1964, this engine was already extinct. The Ford Y-Block, an engineering marvel that arrived too early and left too soon, missing the muscle car party it should have headlined. Today, we're diving into the story of Ford's forgotten V8 and asking the ultimate what-if question. Could this have been the engine that changed everything? To understand the Y-Block story, we need to go back to the early 1950s, when Ford was facing a serious problem. While Cadillac had introduced their overhead valve V8 in 1949 and Oldsmobile followed suit, Ford was still stuck with their ancient flathead V8, a design that dated back to 1932. Sure, the flathead had character, but by the early 50s, it was about as modern as a horse and buggy competing against a jet plane. General Motors was eating Ford's lunch with their superior overhead valve designs, and Ford knew they had to respond fast. The company's engineers, led by the talented team at Dearborn, set out to create something revolutionary. Not just another Me Too engine, but a design that would leapfrog the competition entirely. What they came up with was the Y-Block, and it got its name from one of the most distinctive features you've probably never noticed. Unlike conventional V8s that look like, well, a V when you peek at them from the front, the Y-Block had this incredibly deep skirting around the crankcase. This deep skirting extended way down, making the engine block look more like the letter Y than a traditional V. It wasn't just for looks either. This design provided exceptional rigidity and strength to the entire engine assembly. The Y-Block made its debut in 1954 as a complete replacement for the tired old flathead. Ford didn't mess around with a gradual transition. They went all in. The first Y-Block displaced 239 cubic inches, the same as the flathead it replaced, but that's where the similarities ended. Where the old flathead wheezed out 106 horsepower on its best day, the new Y-Block pumped out a respectable 130 horsepower. That's a 23% power increase from the same displacement, and suddenly Ford had a fighting chance again. But Ford's engineers didn't just match displacement. They also offered a Mercury version with 256 cubic inches, giving their premium brand a little extra muscle right out of the gate. The architecture was completely modern: overhead valves, hydraulic lifters, and a much more efficient combustion chamber design. After decades of flathead limitations, Ford finally had a V8 that could compete with anything Detroit was producing. Here's where the Y-Block gets really interesting, because Ford's engineers made some choices that were either brilliant or completely bizarre, depending on your perspective. The most unusual feature had to be the intake port arrangement, and when I say unusual, I mean completely upside down from what everyone else was doing. Instead of having the intake ports side by side like every other V8 on the planet, Ford stacked them vertically. Picture this: you've got two intake ports per cylinder, but instead of sitting next to each other, one sits directly on top of the other. It looked weird, it was weird, but Ford insisted it was better. And you know what? They might have been right. This stacked port design actually helped equalize the runner lengths in the intake manifold, which meant more consistent fuel and air delivery to each cylinder. It also allowed Ford to position the push rods optimally without interference from the intake runners. From an engineering standpoint, it was actually pretty clever. The problem was that it made the engine a nightmare for hot rodders and tuners who wanted to port and polish the heads. Try working on ports that are stacked on top of each other. It's like trying to perform surgery through a keyhole. The Y block also featured some other interesting design choices. The combustion chambers were compact and efficient, with a wedge shape that promoted good flame travel. The valve train was robust, with solid lifters in the early years giving way to hydraulic lifters for smoother operation. Ford even incorporated their first attempts at reducing internal friction with specially designed bearing surfaces and oil passages. One thing that made the Y block stand out was its incredible strength. Remember that deep skirting I mentioned? It wasn't just for show. This design created an incredibly rigid engine block that could handle serious power without flexing or cracking. We're talking about an engine that was engineered to potentially grow much larger than its initial 239 cubic inch displacement. Ford had big plans for this engine family. The lubrication system was also advanced for its time, with full-pressure oil delivery to all the critical wear surfaces. The oil pump was gear-driven off the camshaft, ensuring reliable oil pressure even at idle. These engines could rack up serious mileage when properly maintained, and many Y blocks are still running strong today, nearly 70 years after they rolled off the production line. But perhaps the most forward-thinking aspect of the Y block was its modular approach to displacement increases. The basic architecture could accommodate larger bores and longer strokes without major redesign work. This scalability would prove crucial as the horsepower wars of the late 1950s began to heat up. 1955 was a pivotal year in automotive history, and it marked the beginning of what would become known as the displacement wars. Chevrolet dropped their legendary small block V8 with 265 cubic inches, and suddenly Ford's 239 cubic inch Y block was looking a little small. But Ford wasn't about to be outdone by the bow tie brigade. Ford's response was swift and decisive. For 1955, they bumped the Y block up to 272 cubic inches, maintaining their displacement advantage over Chevrolet. But more importantly, they increased horsepower to 162 in standard form, with a 4-barrel carburetor version producing 182 horsepower. Ford was flexing their engineering muscles, showing that the Y-block architecture could grow and adapt to meet the competition. The real excitement started in 1956, when Ford introduced the big daddy of Y-blocks, the 312 cubic inch version. This wasn't just a bigger engine, it was Ford's declaration of war in the emerging performance market. The 312 came in several configurations, but the most impressive was the Thunderbird Special version that produced 225 horsepower with a single 4-barrel carburetor. But Ford wasn't done yet. They also offered a dual quad version of the 312 that pumped out an impressive 245 horsepower. These were serious numbers for the mid-1950s, and they put Ford right back in the performance conversation alongside Chevrolet and Chrysler's powerful Hemi V8s. The crown jewel of the Y-block family came in 1957 with the introduction of the supercharged 312. This was factory hot rodding at its finest, a Paxton supercharger bolted to a specially prepared 312 cubic inch Y-block. The result? A factory-rated 300 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful engines available in an American passenger car at the time. This supercharged Y-block was available in both Ford and Mercury models, though it was expensive and relatively rare. The F-code supercharged 312 could propel a 1957 Thunderbird or Fairline to genuinely impressive performance numbers. We're talking about 0 to 60 times in the high 6-second range, which was sports car territory in 1957. While Ford was busy developing their Y-block into a legitimate performance contender, the competition wasn't standing still. Chevrolet's small block V8 was evolving rapidly, and it had some significant advantages that would prove crucial in the long run. The Chevy small block was lighter, more compact, and had a simpler design that made it easier to service and modify. While the Y-block's stacked intake ports were theoretically superior, they made the engine more expensive to manufacture and more difficult for backyard mechanics to work on. In the rapidly growing hot rod and custom car scene, ease of modification was becoming increasingly important. Chevrolet also had something Ford didn't: unlimited scalability. While the Y-block was architecturally limited to around 312 cubic inches without major redesign work, Chevrolet's small block could easily grow to 400 cubic inches and beyond. This scalability would prove crucial as the muscle car era approached and displacement became king. Chrysler was also making moves with their legendary Hemi V8, which offered superior breathing and power potential compared to both the Y-block and Chevrolet's small block. The Hemi's hemispherical combustion chambers allowed for larger valves and better airflow, resulting in impressive power output even from relatively small displacement. Ford found themselves in a difficult position. The Y-block was competitive in the mid-1950s, but its limitations were becoming apparent. The engine was heavy, complex, and reaching the limits of its displacement potential. Meanwhile, the competition was just getting started with engines that had much more room to grow. The writing was on the wall by 1958. While Ford continued to develop the Y-block, company engineers were already working on its replacement, the FE Big Block series, that would debut in 1958. The FE engines addressed many of the Y-block's limitations, with conventional intake port arrangements, lighter construction, and much greater displacement potential. By 1959, Ford had essentially abandoned high-performance development of the Y-block in favor of the new FE engines. The 390, 406, 427, and eventually the legendary 428 Cobra Jet would all trace their lineage back to this recognition that the Y-block had reached its evolutionary dead end. The late 1950s marked the beginning of the end for the Y-block, even though Ford continued to use it in various applications through the early 1960s. The fundamental problem was that the automotive landscape was changing rapidly, and the Y-block's design limitations were becoming increasingly apparent. First, there was the weight issue. The Y-block was substantially heavier than comparable engines from other manufacturers. That deep skirting and robust construction that made it so strong also made it a boat anchor when compared to Chevrolet's lighter small block. In an era where automotive journalists were beginning to focus on power-to-weight ratios and handling characteristics, the Y-block's bulk was becoming a liability. Second, the manufacturing costs were becoming prohibitive. Those unique stacked intake ports that Ford had been so proud of required special casting techniques and more complex machining operations. As volume production became increasingly important to profitability, the Y-block's exotic features were starting to look like expensive complications rather than engineering advantages. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the tuning and modification potential was limited. The hot rod scene was exploding in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and enthusiasts wanted engines they could easily modify and hop up. The Y-block's unusual port configuration and complex internal geometry made it much more difficult to extract additional performance compared to simpler designs like Chevrolet's small block. Ford's introduction of the FE Big Block series in 1958 was essentially an admission that the Y-block concept had reached its limits. The FE engines used conventional port arrangements, lighter construction methods, and architecture that could easily scale up to 500-plus cubic inches. They were everything the Y-block wasn't: simple, powerful, and infinitely modifiable. By 1960, Ford was using Y-blocks primarily in truck applications and lower-performance passenger cars. The high-performance market had moved on to the new FE engines, leaving the Y-block to soldier on in applications where its reliability and durability were more important than its power potential. The final nail in the Y-block's coffin came with the dawn of the muscle car era in the mid-1960s. As manufacturers began stuffing massive engines into intermediate-sized cars, The Y-block's displacement limitations became a fatal flaw. While Chevrolet could offer 396 and 427 cubic inch big blocks, and Chrysler had their 426 Hemi and 446 pack, Ford was stuck with a Y-block that topped out at 312 cubic inches. This is where the Y-block story becomes truly fascinating, not for what it was, but for what it could have been. Ford's engineers had actually designed the Y-block architecture to accommodate much larger displacements, but corporate priorities and market pressures prevented them from fully exploring its potential. Internal Ford documents from the period reveal that engineers had sketched out Y-block designs with displacements ranging up to 400 cubic inches or more. The basic architecture could have supported these larger engines, but it would have required significant investment in new tooling and manufacturing processes. With the FE Big Block program already underway, Ford management decided to not pursue these larger Y-block variants. Imagine if they had. A 390 cubic inch Y-block with modern carburation and tuning could have easily produced 350-plus horsepower in the early 1960s. The engine's inherent strength and robust construction would have made it ideal for high-performance applications. Those unique stacked intake ports, while complex to manufacture, actually provided superior airflow characteristics that could have been advantageous in racing applications. The supercharged Y-block concept also had untapped potential. Ford's 1957 Paxton-blown 312 was impressive, but it was just the beginning. With modern supercharger technology and fuel injection, a developed Y-block could have been a serious contender in the emerging muscle car market. The engine's deep skirt design provided excellent rigidity for forced induction applications. Some dedicated enthusiasts have actually built large displacement Y-blocks in recent years, proving that the concept had merit. These modern builds, with displacements ranging from 350 to over 400 cubic inches, demonstrate the untapped potential of Ford's forgotten V8. With modern machining techniques and aftermarket support, these engines can produce impressive power numbers while retaining the Y-block's characteristic durability. The tragedy is that Ford abandoned the Y-block just as the muscle car era was beginning. If they had invested in developing larger displacement variants instead of moving to the FE series, automotive history might have been very different. The Y-block could have been Ford's answer to Chevrolet's Big Block Mark IV series, offering unique engineering solutions and potentially superior performance. But the Y-block story doesn't end there. Ford continued to produce Y-block engines for international markets well into the 1980s, particularly in Australia and South America. These later international variants often abandoned the unique stacked intake port arrangement in favor of conventional side-by-side ports, making them easier to manufacture and service, but losing much of what made the original Y-block special. In Australia, Ford developed some interesting variants of the Y-block that never made it to American shores. The Australian Ford team created larger displacement versions and even experimented with different head configurations that addressed some of the original design's limitations. These Australian Y-blocks became quite popular in local racing circles, proving that the basic architecture still had competitive potential when properly developed. Today, the Y-block occupies a unique position in automotive history. It's simultaneously one of Ford's most advanced engines of the 1950s and one of their most overlooked power plants. While Chevrolet's small block became legendary and Ford's own FE and Windsor families achieved muscle car immortality, the Y-block remains largely forgotten outside of dedicated Ford enthusiast circles. The irony is that many of the Y-block's problematic features have become desirable in modern engine design. Deep skirt blocks for rigidity, optimized port configurations for airflow, and robust construction for durability are all hallmarks of contemporary high-performance engines. Ford was ahead of their time with the Y-block, but the market wasn't ready for such sophisticated engineering. Modern Y-block enthusiasts have formed a dedicated community that continues to develop and modify these engines. With modern machining techniques, improved materials, and computer-aided design, they've been able to extract performance levels that Ford's 1950s engineers could only dream of. Some modified Y-blocks are producing over 500 horsepower while maintaining the engine's characteristic reliability and durability. You might be wondering why we should care about an engine that was discontinued over 60 years ago, especially one that never achieved mainstream success during its production run. The answer lies in what the Y-block represents in automotive history, a road not taken that might have led to a very different outcome in America's horsepower wars. The Y-block story is fundamentally about timing and corporate decision-making. Ford had a genuinely innovative engine design that addressed many of the performance limitations of earlier V8s, but they abandoned it just as the market was beginning to demand exactly the kind of performance the Y-block could have delivered. It's a classic case of being ahead of your time, then giving up just before the time was right. From a technical standpoint, the Y-block pioneered several design concepts that would become standard in later high-performance engines. The deep skirt construction, optimized port configurations, and robust internal components were all ahead of their time. Modern engine designers have rediscovered many of these concepts, not realizing they were first implemented in Ford's forgotten V8 of the 1950s. The Y-block also represents something that's increasingly rare in modern automotive development: genuine engineering innovation. Ford's designers weren't content to simply copy what everyone else was doing. They developed unique solutions to complex problems. Whether it was the stacked intake ports, the deep skirt block design, or the advanced oiling system, the Y-block was full of original thinking. For collectors and enthusiasts today, Y-block-powered cars offer something different from the mainstream muscle car experience. A 1957 Thunderbird with a supercharged 312 Y-block is just as fast as many more famous muscle cars, but with a completely different character and sound. These engines have their own personality that sets them apart from the more common small-block and big-block Ford engines. The growing interest in Y-block engines also demonstrates how automotive enthusiasm can preserve and develop technologies that the manufacturers abandoned. What started as a forgotten engine family has been transformed by dedicated enthusiasts into a viable alternative for hot rodders and restorers who want something unique and historically significant. The Ford Y-block stands as one of automotive history's great what-ifs, a genuinely innovative engine that had the potential to dominate the muscle car era, but was abandoned just as that era was beginning. While Chevrolet's small block became legendary and Ford's own later engines achieved muscle car fame, the Y-block remained frozen in time, a technological dead end that never got its moment to shine. But perhaps that's what makes it special. In a world where automotive history is dominated by the same familiar names in engines, the Y-block offers something different, a glimpse into an alternate timeline where Ford's engineering innovation could have changed everything. Sometimes the roads not taken are the most interesting ones to explore. What do you think? Could Ford's Y-block have been a muscle car legend if they'd stuck with it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know if you've ever experienced one of these forgotten Ford V8s firsthand.